In May 1943, more than 250,000 Axis soldiers laid down their weapons in a single stretch of desert. More prisoners than at Stalingrad, more than any other German defeat up to that point in the war. And yet, if you ask someone today what the worst military catastrophe of Nazi Germany was, almost no one will answer this one. This is the story of the collapse of the Afrika Korps in Tunisia, and of how Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine turned one of the greatest military disasters of the war into a story of heroic resistance. To understand the scale of the collapse, we have to go back a few months. In November 1942, the Allies landed in North Africa in Operation Torch. At the same time, in Egypt, Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps was already being pushed back after the defeat at El Alamein. German and Italian forces found themselves squeezed between two Allied armies advancing from opposite directions, the British from the east, the Americans and British from the west. Rommel, sick and exhausted, was pulled out of the theater in February 1943 and hospitalized back in Germany. Command passed to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. And here's the first key element of the story. Hitler never authorized an organized withdrawal. The order was clear: hold to the end, no retreat. Meanwhile, the supply of fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements to the troops in Tunisia kept shrinking as Allied naval and air power dominated the Mediterranean and sank much of the German resupply convoys before they ever reached the African continent. In other words, an army surrounded, running out of fuel, running out of ammunition, and forbidden to retreat. In the first week of May 1943, the German lines simply couldn't hold anymore. The Allies broke through the northern defenses at the Battle of Hill 609, and Axis forces began to fragment. One German division, commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel, ran out of fuel and ammunition near Bizerte on May 9 and was forced to surrender. 3 days later, on May 12, 1943, General von Arnim offered the surrender of the entire Army Group Africa. The final radio message from one of the German commanders in the region, General Hans Kramer, to the high command of the Wehrmacht, summed up the situation in a few words: ammunition exhausted, weapons and equipment destroyed. Within days, more than 250,000 German and Italian soldiers, many of them longtime veterans of the Afrika Korps, until then considered one of Nazi Germany's elite fighting forces, were captured. Entire columns of prisoners, stretching for miles, marched off to Allied camps. For comparison, at Stalingrad 3 months earlier, around 91,000 Axis soldiers had surrendered. In Tunisia, the number was far higher. And this is where the story gets really interesting. There's no evidence that the Nazi regime simply erased or fully censored news of the defeat. That would have been impossible to sustain, since hundreds of thousands of German families had relatives fighting in Africa. What the regime did was something more sophisticated. It reshaped the narrative. The main instrument for this was the Wehrmachtbericht, the daily communiqué from the Armed Forces High Command, produced by the propaganda department and broadcast on state radio. Historians describe the tone of these communiques throughout the war as consistently triumphalist, even when the situation at the front was disastrous. This wasn't the first time the regime had needed to pull off this kind of maneuver. 3 months earlier, after the surrender at Stalingrad, Goebbels had delivered one of the most famous speeches of the Nazi regime, the so-called Total War Speech at the Sportpalast in Berlin on February 18, 1943. It was the first time Nazi leadership publicly admitted that Germany faced serious dangers, but that admission came wrapped in a call for total mobilization and heroic sacrifice, not a reflection on the military command's failures. With Tunisia, the same pattern repeated. Instead of presenting the surrender of 250,000 soldiers as the strategic collapse it was, the official narrative emphasized resistance to the very last resource, ammunition exhausted, troops fighting to their physical limit, sacrifice for the fatherland. The image sold to the public was one of soldiers who fought bravely against a numerically and materially superior enemy, not of an entire army captured due to failed logistics and Hitler's refusal to authorize a timely retreat.
It's the same formula used repeatedly by Nazi propaganda throughout the war, turning disastrous command decisions into proof of popular heroism. Regardless of how it was told back home, the defeat in Tunisia changed the course of the war. With the Axis completely expelled from North Africa, the Mediterranean opened up for the Allies. Weeks later, this enabled the invasion of Sicily, the Allies' first step back onto the European continent, and the beginning of the fall of Mussolini's regime in Italy. Germany also permanently lost an experienced army, built up over nearly 3 years of desert campaigning. These were troops, armored vehicles, and officers that would no longer be available for the battles ahead, not in Italy, and not months later in Normandy. In other words, the real cost of this defeat was felt for the rest of the war, even though the official version told to Germans at the time softened the true scale of the disaster. So why is this defeat so little remembered compared to Stalingrad? Part of the answer lies exactly in how effective the propaganda of the time was. A narrative of heroic sacrifice sticks in memory very differently than a narrative of total collapse, even when the numbers tell a much harsher story. The surrender in Tunisia never carried the political symbolism that Stalingrad did, as a direct confrontation with the Soviet Union, nor the same weight in later negotiations among the Allies. But in purely military terms, it was at least as severe a blow. And perhaps that's exactly why the regime worked so hard to rewrite the story, even as it was still unfolding.